Good morning again, everyone. We are just about to start our third press conference of the day, which is entitled Climate, Water, Soils, How Can They Affect Human Health? I'll remind everyone, in case you haven't heard me before, that there will be short presentations by our speakers, and then we'll open the floor for questions from those here in the room and also those watching us online, who can ask questions on Skype by messaging EGU.media or on Twitter by using the hashtag AskEGU. If you have not received the handouts, any materials are available that the speakers have provided are available online at media.egu.eu/documents. I'll now introduce our panel of speakers. The first one is James Tamarios. He's a postdoctoral research fellow at the Environmental Health Sciences at Columbia University. Andrea Rinaldo is a professor at the School of Architecture, Civil and Environmental Engineering, École Polytechnique Fédérale de Lausanne in Switzerland. Eric Breivik is a professor in the Departments of Natural Sciences and Agriculture and Technical Studies at Dixon State University in North Dakota. And Lynn Burgess is also a professor at Dixon State in the Department of Natural Sciences. I'll now hand over to our speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. And I guess I'm going to start off today. I'm going to talk a little bit about the seasonal distribution of influenza worldwide and the effects that environment and climate has on these patterns. So influenza, of course, is something we all know, pretty familiar with. It attacks about 10 to 15% of the population worldwide a year, causes about up to 1 billion infections on average per year, and kills 500,000 to 1 million people. And it's surprising, though, we've known about this disease for a long time. There are still a lot of mechanisms about its spread that we still do not understand. And one of the striking features about it that we don't understand is why it's seasonal. There's actually been a lot of work on this recently. So in this plot here, I'm just showing that the incidence of influenza in the U.S. and Australia. And basically what you can see is in temperate regions of the world, influenza is a very seasonal disease, and it occurs during the wintertime. These epidemics last about 6 to 8 weeks. And of course, because it occurs in the winter, they're 6 months out of phase in the U.S. and in Australia in different hemispheres. And the reason we think this is because the virus actually survives a little bit better when it's dry outside, in terms of absolute humidity, which is the volume of moisture in the air. And this has been shown with laboratory studies and model host studies where they actually infected guinea pigs and put them in cages and then changed the environment. And we're actually able to show that virus transmission increases as specific humidity or absolute humidity decreases. So this does a really good job of explaining why influenza occurs during the wintertime in temperate regions. However, it doesn't explain why it occurs in tropical areas where they're much more humid. So this was an area I looked at during my PhD, is what is going on in the tropics and the subtropics. And basically we found that in the temperate regions, yes, that we had epidemics when specific humidity decreased, but we also found that as specific humidity increases in the tropics, we see more epidemics. So we have this paradox of increase in influenza activity in the temperate regions as it's drier, and an increase when it's wetter in tropical regions. And this was kind of difficult to reconcile, but it suggests that there's two different mechanisms going on here. One perhaps related to virus survival and low specific humidity in these temperate regions, but in these other tropical climates where it doesn't get as dry, there's another mechanism occurring, and we're still not sure what that mechanism is, if it's actually related to specific humidity, or if it's related to precipitation, or and perhaps behavior changes due to precipitation, like people going inside and closing doors and being confined in small spaces. But we're able to, with this information, able to show around the world where these different types of influenza epidemics occur. So in this map here, with the purple areas would be locations where we would see wintertime epidemics. The green locations are where we would see humid, like tropical, rainy season epidemics. And the places in between, the whites and the lighter purples and greens, are places in between. And some of these locations actually actually, there's more uncertainty here. And some of these places, such as Hong Kong and Taiwan, actually see 2 influenza epidemics a year, one in the summertime and then one in the wintertime. And it's thought that this could be related to new pathogens or new viruses springing up in Southeast Asia, because they have a lot of overlap with seasonality down there in Southeast Asia. And with this information, we can also create models that show the environmental favorability worldwide for influenza transmission. Now, this isn't showing you the incidence or anything like that, just giving you an idea of how the environment worldwide varies over the course of the season for the transmission of influenza. And these, as we get further and understand this stuff better, we will be able to improve forecasts of influenza, not just seasonal influenza, but hopefully pandemic influenza. Might also help us with intervention strategy, because this is telling us a little bit about the underlying mechanisms that drive influenza. And yeah, so that is what I have. Thank you, guys.
To turn this one, right?
Yep, there you are.
Yeah, we are there. So it's the punchline on, I'll be talking about the possibility of predicting the evolution of large cholera outbreaks. And my punchline is that geosciences can do a lot of good for modern epidemiology. In fact, it will be central in spatial epidemiology in the near future. And why the Haiti case is so important, so paradigmatic, in fact, it's because it's even on ethical grounds, it's unacceptable that from 2010 to 2012, something like 8,000 people can die. And you have something like 8% of the population reported cases of cholera in one of the poorest countries of the world. And you wonder whether you can do something about it. One of the features that the Haiti thing brought to mind, what you're seeing here is the number of cumulative reported cases in Haiti, is that they somewhat overturned consolidated paradigms in the modeling of those epidemics, meaning you treat like a total number of susceptibles in Haiti like in a single box, like it will occur simultaneously everywhere, whereas the data show otherwise. They show that the data are spatial, and that something that has to do with geophysical attributes, like where rivers go, water pathways that bring, sorry.
Okay.
That's what you want,
Yeah.
right? That the river pathways bring pathogens around, spread pathogens around. There are other factors that can be accumulated. Besides, Haiti has another feature that they never seen cholera for hundreds of years. And what is most shameful, I think, for modern society is that the pathogens were, although there's debate, of course, when scientists are involved, there are always debates, but the source of a pathogen is taken from a faraway geographic source. It was injected in the poorest country of the world, stricken by a disastrous earthquake in which no sanitation infrastructure is available, actually. So what can you do about it? Of course, we have to find out whether modern geosciences can do something for finding out exposure rates. Exposure rates means that you can bring safe water, but if the guy hands you out with dirty hands, you're exposed like if you didn't. And you see, if you go to the markets, and that's the south of the world, actually, in a tropical climate in which, of course, temperatures will have the pathogens thriving in fresh waters and surviving forever. You see what the markets are like. I mean, food is simply placed in a place in which water is running. So what can we do remotely and predict? We have a population fairly well known, in fact, remotely acquired and objectively processed, in fact. And what you see is that from the data, quite interesting, it's not that you can have like simple correlations, like here's the population, here's the number, the attack rates, or the mortality, because that's not what data show, actually. It's kind of a complicated picture. But certainly you can remotely acquire, for instance, the direction of water pathways from digital terrain maps, as you see in here, for which you can extract objectively networks, river networks, hydrological networks, the hydrological controls for which the pathogen can spread and reach different settlements. And human mobility, of course, is also an important factor, because what you have in this system is that if you have an infected person moving to a place, of course, the place where the Vibrio thrives is in the human intestine, and where any discharge from this person in a different place would contaminate the water reservoir therein, leaving no trace if a person gets back. Or if a susceptible person travels to a place that drinks unsafe water, it brings back the disease where it is. So that's the source, in fact, of a geographic distribution of the disease. Of course, then you have to somewhat to model human mobility, which is a hot issue in science anyways. There was a Nature paper a few months ago, and the difference between gravity models and radiation models on this issue is we will be able to quantify fluxes of people migrating from one settlement to another, crucial for understanding how a disease spread. And then there's a hydrologic effect of a different type. For instance, very clear correlation between the revamping of the epidemic and the rainfall, in fact. Rainfall, in fact, brings more pathogens. Obviously, if you please, in a place in which you have, open-air defecation sites, and whenever a tropical storm passes, will bring lots of pathogens into the water reservoir and brings you the water unsafe. So that's a punchline, and what I'll be finishing my talk. It's if you show that data and models can show virtually we see very similar patterns, of course, with distinctions you can discuss forever, of course. But the key idea is, therefore, that mathematical models can predict the course of an ongoing epidemics, thereby could be quite crucial in determining where life-saving medical supplies and staff and infrastructure can be deployed in time for intervention. It can evaluate alternative management strategies, like you can find out what's the effect of preventing safe mobility of people, distribution of vaccines, antibiotics, and the likes. And because of a spatial nature, say the recent results somewhat change the paradigm in the sense that the spatial dimension, which is unavoidable, in fact, brings in geosciences at a very important rate, I believe. So that's my punchline. Thank you.
Okay.
It's you, right?
Yeah, over there. That one. There we go. Well, good afternoon, everybody. I have an interest in soils and what soils can mean from a human health perspective, and in particular with this presentation, some of the interactions that take place between soils and climate change and what that means for human health. Just to start off with, soils are not probably something that a lot of people think about when they think about health issues. And so just to demonstrate some of the ways that soils actually really are important, most of our food comes from soil. And so all of the nutrients that are essential to human health originate in that soil, or a large majority of them do. Through exposure to soils, we can have exposures to pathogens, which cause disease, exposures to a lot of chemicals, which cause health problems. Soils are a natural filter for water. And something a lot of people don't realize is that almost half of all the medications that are used in medicine today actually originate with the soil. So there are a number of very definite connections between the soils themselves and human health. Now, the whole climate change angle comes in because soils themselves are also tied to a number of cycles that are important from an atmospheric perspective. What I have up here is the carbon cycle on the left-hand side, and you can see some of the important pathways that carbon moves around on our planet. On the right-hand side, I've kind of taken and isolated the portion of the carbon cycle that involves soils, and you can see that plants actually have the ability to take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere through photosynthesis. Some of the tissues from those plants end up in the soil when plants or parts of plants die, and some of those plant parts become what we call soil organic matter. It's very important from a nutrient supply perspective, a number of other soil perspectives. And of course, as that organic matter decays, or as the plant biomass decays directly, carbon dioxide goes back to the atmosphere. So we get this cycle going here. But what that means is, when we look at things from a climate change perspective, the single largest component of climate change is anthropogenic climate change is linked to carbon dioxide. And so there are connections between soils and carbon dioxide. If the atmospheric carbon dioxide is changing, soil changes are also going to be taking place based on that change in our atmosphere. So we have a very interlinked system that we're looking at here. So what this ends up meaning is that there are a number of potential health effects that arise linked to soils based on the idea of climate change. And we can kind of break those into two broad categories. We have indirect changes, indirect effects due to soils. We have direct changes. And I've got some indirect effects up here. Those are things that soils are involved in, but less directly so. It's more, it's how the soils interact with the atmosphere and either mitigate or exasperate changes in the atmosphere that involve the indirect effects. Direct effects are things as the climate changes. We're going to see changes in soil processes, including things like the generation of dust, which is a major problem from a human health perspective. Dust itself can carry pathogens on it, can carry chemicals, sometimes in toxic levels that are inhaled and cause health problems. Also, as we have changes in the carbon cycle itself, that could influence soil properties that are very important from food production perspective, and that could cause problems from a human health aspect. So that's what I've got for you, and we'll switch over now to our final speaker. The same one.
Oh, same one, sorry.
Yeah.
Good morning. Good afternoon. I'm a biologist that's interested in human health, and Dr. Breivik's brought me in to work with him on the connection with soil into human health. And we want to give today an example of more of a specific incident that deals directly with soil influencing human health, and this was last year's fungal meningitis outbreak in the United States. Now, the fungus is this E. rosarum, which has caused 594 cases of meningitis or stroke or other central nervous system problems when it starts growing from these injections. There was also some joint infections and 39 deaths because of this. Now, these were all traced to contaminated steroid injections produced by the New England Compounding Center. One small lab that didn't have adequate FDA control. And the connection here that's very, very interesting is how did we get a opportunistic soil pathogen into a injectable medication that occurs. Now, if you look at this epidemiologically, you would think that if they were contaminating directly from soil, that you would have had a lot of other organisms in there, because E. rosarum is not that common. And we'll look into that a little bit more. If you look into this pathogen, there's a lot of different names. It's really difficult to do research into it because you have to try to figure out which one of these you're talking about, where it's going. So I thought I'd list them so you guys could see that if you want to look it up, it's listed in a lot of different ways. And the disease that is caused is because this pathogen starts to grow into the soft tissues. And in the case of the fungal meningitis, it's in the meninges around the brain because it was introduced into through the spinal cord and was able to work up through the tissues. It's very opportunistic. It's going to usually only occurs and only been seen in people where there's some break in your barrier, the skin barrier, or you have a very compromised immune system. In the cases of the people that were infected here, it's because they were injected with it, which is quite unusual and never been seen before. Now, there's listed in the current literature three different names for this, and there's a lot of evidence and has been cited this may be the same fungus, and it's not three separate species. It's just still the same, because this area is not a very studied area. Soil mycology is, a very interesting area, but it doesn't get a lot of literature when you start connecting it back to human health. Now, one of the things we're trying to promote is the role of soil scientists to get involved in the team here. Like me being a biologist brought in, we need to get a larger group of people to look at the life cycle and the soil ecology of it, these type of organisms, because if you can't study and you don't know where they come from, you don't know where they're going to be growing, you don't know how they propagate, you're not going to be able to have an effective disease control to understand about how to handle it, where it's going to be exposed and where it's going. Because I think one of the most important things is how did we end up with just this one particular fungus in these contaminated injections? you know, I would have expected you would have found several different species, maybe some bacteria or something. So that's what I've got.
Thank you very much for your interesting presentations. We'll now open the floor for questions. Does anyone have questions here in the room?
Holger Kroker, Planet Erde.de from Germany. A question to Dr. Burgess. How did this fungus enter the steroid injections? What was the process? And the second question is, what does it cause if it isn't injected, if it just enters through a scar in the skin or something like this?
Okay, the first part is the part that we don't know, which is really the most important question in the whole thing. That's what I was getting at. We have no idea how a single rare soil fungus ended up in a injectable medication. Usually the cases here, I should have put the picture in, but you're going to get a skin infection of it, and it's going to show up as a really sore on the skin that was spread through the skin or whatever tissue it entered. This has never been reported before where you get this case in the brain. Now, there's been cases of a related fungus that has had some cerebral infections. And, you know, I've got a reprint if you want to see and get those names because, you know, they're about this long and nobody knows how to say them, you know, so. But if you want some more information, I have it right here. But, yeah, you're normally going to get this maybe through digesting them and somehow they enter that system, or through a cut or through the skin. That's common, that's seen, that's reported. It's the cerebral that's extremely unusual.
Thank you. Are there any more questions here in the room?
Liz Gallagher from Environmental Research Web. I've got another question for Lynn. How do you think climate change might affect diseases that people could get from soil?
That's more his. Well, of course, it's just like all the other species. Like he talked about the changes in mosquito moving around. It's going to make a big difference because the climate's going to change the soil just like it does everything else. And basically we're warming up. So what we're going to do is a lot of soils are going to have more chances to grow different organisms in them because in some cases they're going to become wetter and they're going to become warmer. You're going to provide more time for them. We're going to get more contact because of that. You're going to get, one of the things we don't look at is the connection between the vectors, the invertebrates, the insects, the other things that live in the soil that can transmit these to us that we have very little information about. What you do is that usually some of these things are very mobile. Like insects move usually before their predators do. We've seen in, for example, movements of mosquitoes into areas that they haven't been seen before. Different species moving into different continents. The same thing happens with your soil organisms, but probably slower.
Becky from Geolog. This is to anyone on the panel. What do you think is the best way we can improve our resilience to human health problems from soil, or what do you think is the best way forward?
Well, I guess just from my perspective on that, one of the big issues we have with understanding human health and soil concerns right now is that it doesn't get a lot of attention, and that's not just from a public perspective, that's also from a scientific perspective. And a big part of that is that it doesn't fit into our traditional funding models. If you go looking for research funding to do soils and human health research, we've got certain groups that usually fund soils research, we've got certain groups that usually fund human health research, and they're two completely separate groups that don't talk to each other. And so, you know, funding and getting people involved is a big problem in terms of advancing our knowledge in this area. we need the opportunity to get out and do this work. We need to know more about it.
I think what we also need to do is you've got to include a lot of different groups. Like, basically, I'm a toxicologist, and he's a soil scientist. Now we're trying to work together to look at this area and advance some of the ideas. We need the other person I need right here is a soil mycologist to look at the fungus and work with the three of us, because one person can't do it. One discipline can't do it.
And the whole soil scientist and toxicologist, that's not a traditional pairing in terms of research. So.
Thank you. Are there any other questions?
This is a question from a Twitter user for Dr. Ronaldo. Can you use your model for other diseases besides cholera?
That's quite an interesting question. And as long as it's waterborne, the pathogen is waterborne, you would have to characterize the ecology of a pathogen differently, but certainly the concept applies. So I'm confident that whether you're talking about sigilosis or rotavirus or other waterborne disease, and in that I presume that part of interest, in fact, although this can be done. But yet, even cholera, you see, it's a shame that now when we are talking about epidemics like in medieval ages, we still had thousands of people dying wherever you just need a hydration bag to be brought to the place and placed to a person. Just simply a shame. So predicting where the infection will spread, I think to me it's a reasonable task and quite worthwhile in my view. But it's the entire group that I haven't mentioned. It's a large group centered in the EPFL, but there's a Milan Polytechnic involved, there's Princeton University involved too. Different researchers with different competencies. And yet, say, looking ahead, it seems to me that geosciences can have a lot to do with that, with this, the modern epidemiology which is being born, in which, say, model-guided field validation and mathematical modeling can do lots of good, I think.
Thank you. Are there any more questions? If there are no more questions, we'll break here for lunch. And the next press conference is at 2 p.m. on disaster risk management. Thank you. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you.